The sun hung low above the plains that afternoon, its gold light filtering through the church's dusty windows, casting soft halos on wooden pews and lace veils. Inside, the townsfolk of Willow Creek had gathered in their Sunday best for a wedding that promised to be the event of the season. The air smelled faintly of lilac and hope. At the front stood Clara Dawson, a young woman of quiet grace. Her gown was simple but beautiful, a modest white dress she had sewn herself from months of saved fabric scraps. Her eyes were tender pools of faith and fear, fixed on the man she thought would be her forever. Henry Miller, the merchant's son, the town's pride, and the man who had once promised her the world. The pastor began the ceremony, his voice deep and warm when suddenly from the second pew, a voice broke the peace, sharp, proud, and cold. "Stop this nonsense right now." Gasps rippled through the room. Henry's mother, Mrs. Miller, rose from her seat, her gloved hands trembling not with age but with outrage. "She cannot marry my son," she declared, her voice slicing through the murmurs. "Not this orphan girl. She has no dowry, no property, no name. My son will not disgrace our family by marrying beneath him." The silence that followed was heavy, cruel. Clara turned to Henry, her heart pounding. "Henry," she whispered, "tell her she's wrong." But Henry, pale, sweating, cowardly, could not meet her eyes. His lips parted, but no defense came. The truth lay bare in his silence. Clara's throat tightened. She felt every gaze upon her, pitying, judgmental. Her bouquet slipped from her trembling hands, landing with a soft thud on the wooden floor. She could barely breathe as she turned and fled, her gown catching on the pews, her veil tearing like the shreds of a dream. Outside, the afternoon wind whipped through the town square, scattering petals from the bouquets that had once promised joy. Clara stumbled down the steps, tears blurring the world into water and dust. The church bells, which were meant to ring in celebration, now tolled like mourning. She ran until the town faded behind her, until her lungs burned and her shoes split. The endless prairie opened before her, golden and merciless. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, she was miles from Willow Creek, her dress mud-streaked, her heart shattered. Night came swift and cold. Clara found an old barn by the river, abandoned, roof half collapsed. Inside, she sank to the floor, pulling the torn veil from her hair. For the first time since her parents' death 2 winters ago, she cried like a child. Her voice broke in prayer. "God, if I'm not meant to be loved, then at least let me rest. Just a home, that's all I ask." The wind howled through the cracks of the barn, carrying with it the scent of rain and thunder. Far across the plains, a man rode alone. Ethan McCall, the richest rancher for miles, known for his wealth, his cattle empire, and his loneliness. His wife had died 7 years ago in childbirth, and with her his laughter had gone too. The people called him proud, but he was simply broken. He worked from dawn until the moon rose, eating alone, sleeping beside a silence that never ended. That night, as lightning flashed across the horizon, Ethan saw something strange. A faint flicker of firelight inside the old barn near the river. Curious, he dismounted and approached. His boots sank into the mud as thunder growled overhead. He pushed the barn door open, expecting to find drifters or trouble, but what he found instead made him stop cold. A woman. A young woman in a ruined wedding dress, asleep on the hay, her face streaked with tears and rain. For a long moment, Ethan simply stared. Something stirred deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. He took a cautious step closer, his shadow falling over her. Her eyes fluttered open, frightened, confused. "Who are you?" she whispered. He removed his hat. "Just a man trying to keep dry from the storm," he said softly. "Didn't mean to startle you." She sat up, clutching the remains of her veil. "I'll go if you want me to." He shook his head. "You look like you've had enough of going." The words lingered between them, warm despite the cold. He looked at her face, the kind of beauty that wasn't delicate but brave. "What's your name?" "Clara," she murmured. "Clara Dawson. Where's home, Miss Dawson?" Her voice cracked. "Nowhere." Something inside Ethan twisted. He understood that word too well. He nodded slowly and said, "Then maybe you can rest a while at mine. I've got more rooms than I can count and not a soul to fill 'em." She looked at him, unsure whether to trust this stranger. But the storm outside left her no choice. Ethan offered his hand. For a moment she hesitated. Then she placed her trembling fingers in his. His hand was calloused but steady, strong but gentle, and so, under the growl of thunder and the watch of heaven, the rejected bride climbed onto the horse of a man who didn't know he was about to find the one thing he'd long stopped believing in: love. When Clara awoke, sunlight spilled through lace curtains, soft and warm. For a moment she didn't remember where she was. The scent of coffee and wood smoke drifted through the air, and the faint sound of horses echoed outside. She sat up, clutching the quilt that covered her. Her torn wedding dress lay neatly folded over a chair. Beside it was a tray, fresh bread, eggs, and a steaming cup of coffee. The sight of such care, so simple yet profound, made her chest tighten. After everything that had happened, kindness felt like a wound, tender and frightening. She rose slowly and walked to the window. The view stole her breath. The McCall Ranch stretched across miles of open prairie, golden under the morning sun. Cattle dotted the fields, and the wind carried the low whistle of men working, the bark of a dog, the pulse of life. For a woman who had lost everything, it was almost too much beauty to bear. Moments later, there was a knock on the door. "Come in," Clara said softly. The man who entered seemed to bring half the light with him. Ethan McCall stood tall, his presence filling the room. Rough, weathered, commanding. His shirt sleeves were rolled, showing the strength in his forearms, and his hat hung loosely in his hand. But his eyes, gray as a storm, held something gentle. "You're awake," he said quietly. "I was starting to think you'd sleep clear through the day." Clara blushed faintly. "I didn't mean to. I was so tired." "Don't apologize for rest," Ethan said. "You looked like you hadn't seen comfort in a long while." He set a small pouch on the table. "I sent a hand into town for fabric and things you might need, and the housekeeper can bring more food when you're ready." Clara blinked, confused. "You don't even know me, Mr. McCall. You don't owe me this." He gave a small smile, the first she'd seen. "Maybe I don't, but I figure the world's been cruel enough to you. Someone ought to show it can be kind too." The words nearly undid her. She looked down at her hands, unsure what to say. Ethan turned toward the window, gazing out over the land. "I've been thinking, Miss Dawson," he said slowly, "about what brought you out to that barn. A woman don't run into a storm in her wedding dress unless she's got nowhere else to go." She stiffened. "You heard?" "Small towns talk fast," he said softly. "I heard enough." Humiliation burned in her throat again. "Then you must know what they think of me." Ethan turned back to her, his voice low and firm. "I don't give a damn what they think. I make up my own mind." There was something in his tone, a quiet strength that silenced her fear. He walked toward her, stopping a few feet away. "Miss Dawson," he said, "I'll speak plain. I need a woman, and you need a home." The words hung in the still air. Clara's heart stumbled. "What did you say?" "I said," he repeated, "I need a woman. This ranch, this house, they're alive but empty. I've got men to run my cattle, hands to mend my fences, but no soul to fill these rooms. And you?" He paused, his gaze softening. "You're a woman who's got courage. I saw it last night. You didn't beg or whimper. You faced the storm and lived through it." She felt her cheeks flush, torn between offense and awe. "You're asking me to—" He raised a hand. "I'm not asking you to love me, Clara. I'm asking you to live here, to have shelter, safety, a place that's yours. In return, you help keep the house, help with the men's meals, the books, and whatever you wish. You can stay as long as you please." Her eyes filled with tears she didn't want to shed. "Why? Why would you do that for me?" Ethan hesitated, looking down at his hat. "Because once, a woman saved me when I didn't deserve saving. My wife, she had a heart too big for this cruel world. When she died, I promised myself I'd never let another soul freeze alone if I could help it." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion neither dared to name. Clara turned away, staring out at the prairie. "If I stay, so people will talk." He gave a quiet laugh. "Let 'em. Folks'll talk whether you're a saint or a sinner. They always do. She looked back at him then, truly seeing him. The loneliness behind his eyes, the quiet longing he tried to bury. For a moment she wondered what kind of man he'd been before grief hollowed him out. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll stay," Ethan said softly. "You don't owe me anything. Just stay." Her chest ached. The offer was simple, but behind it was something vast and wordless. A man like him didn't make gestures of mercy lightly. Finally, she nodded. "I'll stay. For a while." Ethan's lips curved faintly. "That's all I ask." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Clara?" "Yes?" "You don't have to wear that dress again," he said gently. "You've got no reason to keep the past hanging on you." After he left, Clara sank into the chair and stared at the folded gown. Once a symbol of love, now only a relic of betrayal. She picked it up slowly, ran her fingers along the torn lace, and then, with trembling resolve, carried it outside. Behind the house, under the wide blue sky, she set fire to it. The smoke rose into the wind, gray and soft, like a spirit being freed. From a distance, Ethan watched her through the window. The flames painted her face gold, her hair glinting like sunlight on wheat. She looked like a woman being reborn. That night, the ranch fell quiet except for the sighing of the wind. Clara sat by the window in her new room, wearing a simple cotton dress, her hair loose. She felt safe, something she hadn't known in years. Downstairs, Ethan sat in the study staring at the dying fire. He'd made his offer out of decency, but the truth was, Clara Dawson had stirred something dangerous inside him, something he hadn't dared to feel since his wife's death. When she had looked at him, broken yet brave, he'd felt the world shift slightly back toward light. He told himself it was only kindness, only compassion. But deep down, he knew. This woman, this stranger, was the first warmth to enter his home in 7 long, silent years. Days passed into weeks. Clara began to move like sunlight through the house. She polished the brass lamps, mended the curtains, and filled the air with quiet humming. The men on the ranch spoke of her with respect, not pity. She smiled when she passed them in the yard, and they tipped their hats like she was the ranch's beating heart. Ethan, though, kept his distance. He watched her from afar, in the mornings when she fed the chickens and at dusk, when she stood on the porch watching the sky turn crimson. Sometimes he'd find her in the garden, tending the roses his wife had planted. She'd kneel in the soil, her hands covered in earth, her lips moving softly in thought. Once he'd asked what she was thinking. She had looked up and said that even the things that die can bloom again, if someone cares enough to tend them. Ethan couldn't answer. He'd only nodded and walked away, because her words had struck too close to home. One evening, as twilight deepened, Clara came into the study where Ethan was working. "Mr. McCall," she began, "I just wanted to thank you for giving me a home." He set down his pen. "You don't have to thank me, Clara. The house thanks you, it's alive again." She smiled, faint and soft. "I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again. But here," she paused, her eyes shimmering. "Here I do." Ethan's chest tightened. He rose, crossing the room until he stood before her. "Good. You deserve that." They stood close enough that he could see the faint freckles across her nose, the way her lashes trembled. The silence between them wasn't awkward, and it was alive, humming with something that neither dared to touch yet. Then she whispered, "I don't want to be a burden." "You could never be," he said. "You're the first good thing to walk through that door in years." Her breath caught. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold still, the fire crackling, the night wind sighing. Then Ethan stepped back, breaking the spell. "It's late. You should rest." She nodded, but when she turned to go, she looked back once, and in that glance both of them knew something had begun, something neither of them had asked for, but both desperately needed. By the time spring unfolded across the plains, the McCall ranch had changed. The wind still swept dust across the fences, The men still worked from dawn to dusk, but something gentle had entered the land. Windows stayed open now. The curtains fluttered like laughter. Clara Dawson had brought life back into the house. At first she moved carefully, afraid to take up space. She kept to her chores, washing linens, tending the garden, baking bread that filled the halls with the scent of cinnamon. But slowly, day by day, she found herself humming as she worked. When she laughed at a stable hand's joke, even the horses seemed to lift their heads. The ranch hands began calling her Miss Clara with a respect that bordered on affection. Ethan noticed everything. He told himself he was simply grateful for her help, yet he found excuses to be near her. He would linger by the corral while she fed the chickens, pretending to check the fence posts. He would pass by the kitchen door at supper time, drawn by the sound of her singing. Soft, uncertain songs that wrapped around his heart like warm smoke. At first, their conversations were practical. "Fence on the south ridge is loose," he'd say. "I'll send one of the boys," she'd answer. But as the days stretched into weeks, the words grew longer. "Do you miss the town?" he asked one evening. She looked up from the porch railing. "No, the town was never home. It was just where I lived." He nodded slowly, turning his hat in his hands. "Home's a strange thing. You don't know what it means till you lose it." Their eyes met, and the silence between them spoke what neither dared to say, that they both knew loss like few others did. The heart of the house inside. Clara began tending to rooms long forgotten. She dusted portraits, opened windows sealed for years, and found Ethan's late wife's piano beneath a sheet. She hesitated before lifting the cover, her fingers brushing the keys. The first note she played was hesitant, the second steady until a simple melody filled the room. Ethan came in quietly, stopping at the doorway. The sight of her sitting at that piano stirred old memories, both sweet and cruel. He had not heard music in that house since the day his wife died. For a moment he almost asked her to stop, but Clara's music wasn't sorrowful. It was soft, healing, like the land after rain. When she turned and saw him, she rose immediately. "I didn't mean—" he shook his head. "Don't stop." The house needed that, she smiled shyly, and in that small smile Ethan felt something within him begin to breathe again. From that night on, Clara played often, at dusk while the men finished their supper, while the lamps flickered in the windows. The ranch, once a silent monument to grief, now pulsed with quiet life. Two lonely souls one evening, a storm rolled in from the west. The sky turned black and the wind screamed through the valley. Clara hurried to shutter the windows when thunder cracked like a rifle shot. She gasped, dropping the latch. Within moments, Ethan was there, steadying her hands. "It's just thunder," he said, his voice low and calm. "It sounds like the world's breaking," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "It does that sometimes, but it always settles by morning." Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in silver light. For a moment they stood close, her breath trembling, his heart thundering in rhythm with the storm. The air between them felt charged, alive. "Sit by the fire," he said. "I'll make coffee." When he returned, she sat wrapped in a blanket, her eyes on the flames. He poured 2 cups and joined her. The warmth between them was almost unbearable in its simplicity. After a while, Ethan spoke quietly. "You remind me of her sometimes." "Your wife?" she asked softly. He nodded. She had that same way of facing storms. Scared, but standing anyway. Clara's throat tightened. "You loved her very much." He stared into the fire. "I did. And when she died, I buried the part of me that knew how." Silence filled the room. Rain hammered the roof. Thunder rolled like drums across the plains. Then Ethan turned to her, eyes shining with a sadness that felt ancient. "But lately," he said, "I've been remembering how it felt to be alive." Clara's heart twisted. She reached out, resting her hand over his. It was a small gesture, but it carried all the understanding words couldn't give. His hand was warm, rough, trembling just slightly beneath hers. Neither spoke again that night. When the storm passed, he walked her to her door, and as she turned to go inside, he said softly, "Sleep easy, Clara." For the first time since her wedding day, she did. Whispers in the wind after the storm, the days brightened. Clara rose with the dawn, her spirit lighter. She began helping with the books, learning the rhythm of ranch life. She rode horses again, though timidly at first. Ethan taught her how to handle the reins, his voice steady behind her as they rode along the ridge. "You've got a natural hand," he said. She smiled. "Or maybe I've got a good teacher," he chuckled, an easy, rich sound that startled them both. She turned in the saddle, surprised. "I didn't know you could laugh." "Neither did I," he admitted. It became a pattern, quiet moments that turned into laughter, glances that lingered a heartbeat too long. But they never crossed the invisible line between them. Perhaps they both feared breaking the fragile peace they had built. The townsfolk began to talk. When Ethan rode into Willow Creek for supplies, whispers followed him. The widower and the orphan girl. He ignored them, but he noticed Clara's worry when he told her. "I don't care what they say," she insisted. "I just don't want to cause you trouble." "You couldn't," he said simply. "Let 'em talk. I've lived too long listening to ghosts. I won't start listening to gossip." She smiled, though a flicker of sadness lingered in her eyes. Deep down, she feared she could never truly belong to a man like him. He was wealth and land and history. She was a girl who'd once been left at the altar. But when he looked at her, she felt none of that mattered. A new warmth summer came early that year. One afternoon, Ethan found her in the meadow gathering wildflowers. The sun turned her hair to gold, her skirt brushing the grass like a whisper. He stood watching, silent, until she turned and caught him. "Mr. McCall," she teased, "if you stare any longer, the flowers will wilt." He laughed, lifting his hands. "Guilty. They're not half as fine as the sight of you there." Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. For the first time, the air between them changed, no longer cautious but electric. Ethan took a step closer. "Clara," he said softly, "do you ever think maybe the Lord gives second chances?" Her breath caught. "I think maybe he does, if we're brave enough to take them." He nodded, his gaze steady on her face. "Bravery I can manage. It's hope I've forgotten how to hold." She wanted to tell him he hadn't forgotten, that he was holding it right now, standing in front of her. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she reached up and tucked a wildflower behind his lapel. He caught her hand and held it for a moment too long. The touch sent a shiver through them both. Then, with a quiet smile, she pulled away and walked back toward the house. Ethan stood in the meadow long after she was gone, his heart pounding like a man half his age. That night, he couldn't sleep. He walked through the empty halls, every creak of the floorboards echoing with memory and longing. The piano caught his eye, the one Clara had brought back to life. He touched the keys and a single note rang out. The sound was raw, pure. Upstairs, Clara heard it. She smiled into her pillow, whispering into the darkness. "He's learning to live again." A quiet confession, a few evenings later.
As the sky bled into gold and rose, Ethan found Clara on the porch with her sewing.
The sun painted her face with soft light, and the sight made his chest ache. "You've made this place something it wasn't before," he said. She looked up. "What's that?" "Alive." She lowered her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "It was always alive, Ethan. It just needed someone to see it." He leaned against the railing beside her, close enough to smell the lavender in her hair. "And what about you, Clara? What do you need?" She met his gaze, her lips parting. But before she could speak, one of the ranch hands called from the yard, breaking the moment. She smiled faintly and rose, leaving her needlework behind. Ethan picked up the small piece of cloth she'd been mending. A handkerchief, embroidered with a single word in delicate thread. Hope. He held it in his hands for a long time, feeling something rise in his chest he could no longer deny. By the end of summer, the change was complete. The ranch was not only prosperous but peaceful. And in the quiet between chores, between words and glances, love grew. Not in wild passion, but in the slow, enduring way that roots sink deep into the earth. Neither of them said the word aloud. They didn't have to. It was in the way she poured his coffee in the morning, in the way he brushed her hand when he passed her a plate, in the way their eyes met when the world went still. The house no longer belonged to ghosts. It belonged to them. And though neither could see the future, both could feel it coming, like a storm gathering far off on the horizon. Autumn settled over the plains with a hush of gold and smoke. The hills blazed with color and the air smelled of harvest and wood fire. Clara loved this season best. It felt like the world exhaling after a long sorrow. The McCall Ranch thrived under Ethan's quiet leadership and her gentle hand. Together they had turned grief into life again. But peace in the west was a fragile thing, easily disturbed by hoofbeats on the horizon. A stranger in town one crisp morning. The ranch foreman rode hard from Willow Creek, dust rising behind his horse. Ethan met him at the gate. "There's someone asking after you," the man said. "Says his name's Samuel Carter. Came on the noon stage." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Carter?" The name hit Clara like a whip crack when she overheard it from the porch. The world seemed to tilt under her feet. Samuel Carter, her former fiancé. The man who had left her standing at the altar in a faded church dress while the townsfolk whispered. She set down the milk pail slowly. Her hands shook. She thought she had buried that part of her life forever. Ethan looked up, reading the fear in her eyes. "You know him?" "Yes," she said faintly. "I once believed I'd be his wife." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan nodded. "If he's coming here, you won't face him alone. Old wounds, old words by evening." Samuel Carter arrived at the ranch, tall, well-dressed, with the arrogance of a man who thought the world owed him an explanation, rather than the other way around. His boots were clean, his voice smooth as whiskey. But when he saw Clara, something uneasy flickered in his eyes. "Clara," he said, removing his hat, "you look well. Better than I expected." She stood straight, the soft breeze tugging at her skirt. "I am well, Mr. Carter. What brings you here?" "I came to make things right," he said, glancing toward Ethan. "I heard you were working for McCall and, well, I thought maybe you'd need someone who could offer you more than chores and dust." Ethan's shoulders stiffened. "You're standing on my land, Carter." "Mind your tongue." Samuel smiled thinly. "Didn't mean offense, sir. Just concern for a lady I once cared about." "You lost that right when you left her," Ethan said quietly. The tension between them thickened like storm clouds. Clara's pulse pounded in her throat. She had dreamed of this confrontation 100 times, yet now that it was real, she felt only weariness. "Please," she said softly, "there's nothing to fix." The past is gone, but Samuel wasn't listening. His gaze swept over the house, the stables, the acres of grasslands that rolled toward the horizon. Jealousy glimmered behind his charm. "So this is where you've been hiding," he said, "living under McCall's roof. Folks in town say you're more than just his housekeeper." Clara's breath caught. "That's a lie." Ethan stepped forward. "Enough," Samuel's smirk widened. "Didn't figure you for the jealous type, McCall." Before he could say another word, Ethan's fist met his jaw. Samuel staggered back, blood at the corner of his mouth. "You've had that coming," Ethan growled. Clara grabbed Ethan's arm. "Please don't, he isn't worth it." Ethan turned to her, chest heaving, eyes full of a fury she had never seen before. Fury born not of hate, but of fear. "He hurt you once. I won't let him again." She touched his face gently. "He can't, not anymore." The storm within that night, the ranch was silent. Samuel had ridden off, but his words lingered like poison. Clara sat by the fire, twisting her hands in her lap. Ethan stood by the window, staring out at the dark fields. Finally, she spoke. "You shouldn't have hit him. Should have done it years ago," he muttered. "Ethan." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "You can't fight every ghost that haunts me." He turned, his expression raw. "He called you mine, Clara, and the worst part is I wanted it to be true." Her breath caught. "You don't mean that." "I do," he said hoarsely. "I told myself I just wanted to give you a home, but it's more than that. You've made this place worth living again. You've made me worth something again." Tears welled in her eyes. "Ethan." He took a step closer. "Tell me to stop and I will." She didn't. Instead, she whispered, "You're not the only one who's afraid to love again." The distance between them disappeared. His hands came up to her face, rough and trembling, and she leaned into his touch like she had been waiting all her life for it. Their first kiss wasn't perfect, it was hesitant, full of old pain and new hope, but when it ended, neither of them looked away. Outside, the wind rose, scattering leaves across the porch, but inside the ranch house there was only warmth, consequences and choices the next morning. News spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. Samuel Carter had told everyone that Clara Dawson was living as Ethan McCall's mistress. The gossip burned through the town, poisoning every ear it reached. A sheriff came to the ranch that afternoon, not to arrest anyone, but to clear the air. Ethan met him on the porch, his jaw set. "People talk, Ethan," the sheriff said. "You know how small towns are." "I do," Ethan said coldly. "And they'll stop talking soon enough." Inside, Clara packed her few belongings. "I can't stay," she said when Ethan came in. "Not after what they're saying. You'll lose respect, your business, everything." He took her hands. You think I care about that? I care about you. She shook her head, tears slipping free. You've given me a home. Ethan, don't lose yours for me. He stared at her for a long moment, then said quietly, If this place ain't home for you too, Clara. It means nothing. She couldn't answer. She turned and walked out, leaving him standing in the doorway as the sun sank behind the hills. Redemption at dawn that night, Ethan rode to town. He found Samuel Carter in the saloon, boasting to anyone who would listen. The moment Ethan entered, silence fell. He crossed the floor, his boots heavy on the wooden planks. You've done enough damage, Ethan said. Samuel sneered. You gonna hit me again, rancher? Ethan shook his head. No, I'm gonna tell the truth. He turned to the crowd. Clara Dawson is the bravest woman I've ever met. She came to my ranch with nothing but her heart, and she gave it life again. She ain't my mistress. She's the reason I can look a man in the eye and call myself whole. The room was silent. Samuel's smirk faltered. Without another word, Ethan left. The next morning, he returned to the ranch to find Clara waiting by the gate, her bag still packed. I heard what you said, she whispered. You shouldn't have done that, he smiled faintly. I'd say it again, she stepped closer. Then maybe I should stay to make sure you keep your word. He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. A new dawn. The first snow came early that year. The valley lay quiet and white, smoke curling from the chimney, the scent of pine in the air. Clara sat by the fire, her sewing forgotten in her lap. Ethan entered quietly, holding 2 cups of coffee. World looks different today, he said. She smiled. It does, he sat beside her. Clara, when I asked you to stay, it wasn't out of pity or need. It was because you belong here. With me, she met his gaze. I know, and I do. Outside, the sun rose over the snow-covered fields, lighting the ranch like a promise kept. The ghosts were gone. Only love remained, steady, quiet, and unshakable as the land itself. Winter came to Willow Creek in silence, wrapping the plains in frost and stillness. The McCall Ranch stood proud against the cold, smoke curling from the chimneys, horses huddled near the barns. Life had slowed, but within those walls warmth burned bright. For the first time in years, Ethan McCall was not haunted by ghosts. The echoes of the past, the laughter of his late wife, the bitterness of loss, had softened into memory. In their place lived something real, fragile, and fiercely alive. Clara. She had stayed. And with her staying, the world itself seemed to change. The house reborn each morning, Clara woke to the sound of the wind against the shutters and Ethan's low voice calling from the yard. She no longer feared belonging. The home that had once felt borrowed now felt hers in every way that mattered. She baked bread for the ranch hands, mended coats by the fire, and at night she played soft melodies on the piano. The men respected her. The townsfolk, once cruel with gossip, now looked on with quiet admiration. Even the sheriff tipped his hat whenever he passed. Time, as it often does in the West, had erased the sharp edges of scandal and left behind only truth. Ethan, meanwhile, had changed too. He was still the stoic rancher, but now there was a calmness in his eyes, a peace that came from knowing he was no longer alone. Where he once spoke in gruff half-sentences, he now found words came easier, especially when he was speaking to her. The letter one evening, as snow began to fall thick and heavy, a writer brought a letter addressed to Clara. She recognized the handwriting immediately, Samuel Carter's. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Clara, by the time you read this, I'll be gone from Willow Creek. I wronged you deeply, and I'll spend my life making peace with that. I see now that what I called love was pride. McCall is a good man, the kind I never was. Be happy if you can. You deserve it. Samuel, she read it twice, her heart a tangle of relief and sorrow. When she finally looked up, Ethan was watching her quietly from the doorway. Bad news? He asked. She shook her head. No, just an ending. He crossed the room, took the letter from her hands, and fed it to the fire. The flames curled around the paper, devouring the past in silence. Ethan took her hands in his eyes warm with something deeper than words. Then let's start from the beginning, you and me. Her breath caught. Are you asking me to? He smiled faintly. I'm asking if you'll let this old rancher make you his wife. For a moment she couldn't speak. Tears slipped free, glittering in the firelight. Then she nodded, laughing softly through them. Yes, Ethan, yes. The wedding under the pines, they married quietly, beneath the tall pines behind the house. Snow drifted like lace through the air, and the sky was pale gold with morning light. A preacher from town said the words. The ranch hands stood in a small circle around them, hats held to their chests. There was no finery, no grand feast, only truth and love and the sound of wind in the branches. Clara wore a simple white shawl and the same locket she had once planned to wear on her wedding day years before. But this time the locket was not a reminder of loss. It was a symbol of how far she had come. When Ethan placed the ring on her finger, his hand trembled slightly. I can't promise I'll never be stubborn or wrong, he said. But I can promise you this, whatever life brings, you'll never face it alone again. Clara smiled through her tears. That's all I ever wanted. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and as the men cheered softly, Ethan kissed her. Slow and certain, like a man sealing a vow not just with his lips, but with his soul. Spring and the child by the time spring returned to the plains. The ranch was alive again, calves in the pasture, wildflowers along the fence line, the river singing with meltwater. Clara, now visibly expecting, spent her days in the garden and her evenings on the porch, her hands resting over the gentle curve of her belly. Ethan treated her as though she were made of glass, though she often laughed and told him she'd survived worse than a bit of pregnancy. Still, he hovered near, protective in the way of men who have lost too much and finally learned the value of keeping close what they love. One quiet evening, as the sun fell red across the horizon, Clara said, Do you ever wonder what she'd think of us? Your first wife, I mean. Ethan was silent for a long time. Then he said softly, I think she'd be glad. She knew me better than anyone, and she'd hate to see me spend my life alone. You didn't take her place, Clara. You gave me a new one. Her eyes shone. And you gave me what I never thought I'd have again, a reason to trust love. He kissed her forehead, whispering, Then maybe we both found what we were needin' all along. The night the baby came, the night their child came into the world, a storm rolled in from the mountains, the kind that shook the windows and turned the skies black. Clara's labor was long, and Ethan stayed by her side through every cry, every prayer, holding her hand and whispering, You can do this, sweetheart. You're stronger than you know. At dawn, the storm broke. The rain stopped, the wind stilled, and the cry of a newborn filled the air. It's a girl, the midwife said, smiling as she placed the tiny bundle in Clara's arms. Ethan looked down, his heart swelling until it ached. The baby's hair was dark as midnight, her eyes the same clear blue as her mother's. What'll we call her? He asked softly. Clara smiled weakly. Hope. Her name is Hope. Ethan nodded, his throat too tight for words. The name was perfect. It was everything they had lived for, everything they had fought through, the proof that even the most wounded hearts could begin again. Years later, 5 years passed. The ranch thrived under Ethan's steady hand and Clara's warmth. Little Hope grew wild and free, barefoot, laughing, chasing butterflies through the tall grass. The townsfolk adored her. She carried her mother's kindness and her father's quiet strength. Sometimes, when the evenings turned golden and the valley glowed with sunset, Ethan would sit on the porch, Clara beside him and Hope asleep in her arms. He'd watch the light fade and say, Never thought I'd see the world this way again. Clara would smile, resting her head on his shoulder. What way? Has something worth waking up to. The years had carved lines into his face, but they were the kind that came from laughter, not pain. The ghosts were long gone. In their place was the sound of a child's laughter, the scent of supper on the stove, and the peace of knowing that love, once found, had stayed. The final scene, that summer morning, Ethan rode out early. The sun was rising over the hills, painting the sky in pink and gold. He paused at the ridge and looked back at the ranch, the White House, the barn, the smoke rising from the chimney. Clara stood in the doorway, her hand shading her eyes, Hope waving beside her. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. All the pain, the loss, the years of loneliness, they felt like distant shadows now. He touched the brim of his hat, smiled, and whispered into the wind, Thank you. Down in the valley, Clara watched him ride, her heart full. She knew he'd come back soon, he always did. This was their life now. Simple, steady, built on the bones of two broken souls who had found their way home. As the sun climbed higher, Clara whispered to her daughter, "That's your father. Hope, he once told me I needed a home. But he was wrong." She smiled, eyes shining with love. We both needed each other. And with that, the wind carried her words across the golden fields, a promise eternal as the land itself.